I'm sure many of you have now seen the controversy surrounding Tucker Carlson saying on Joe Rogan that the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945 by the United States was evil. And I'm sure you've seen Ben Shapiro and some other to the right commentators say that Tucker Carlson's wrong, that the bombing was right. And they even say that it's just a left-wing thing that Tucker's tapped into, that he's being left-wing and making these conversations. In fact, before I even begin, let's listen to what Ben Shapiro had to say in the clip with Tucker that follows.
But there is a theory that has now risen on the right that there is something deeply malign about the United States, something deeply wrong with the United States. This was made apparent over the weekend. Tucker Carlson was on Joe Rogan's show. Obviously, I'm very friendly with Joe. I think Joe does a great job during his interviews. And there was a clip from this interview that went particularly viral. This is a clip in which Tucker Carlson calls the United States evil for having dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, ending World War II, and then suggests that anyone who would justify that is also evil, which is a very traditionally left-wing perspective. It is not traditionally a particularly right-wing perspective because most people on the conservative side of the aisle tend to believe that America is a force for good in the world. And as we'll discuss, it turns out that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was necessary for ending World War II and likely saved millions of lives, both American and Japanese. But here is Tucker.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis
I
did.
love that. How'd that work? How'd that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like, it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no?
So there you have Tucker Carlson saying what he said. You heard what Shapiro said ahead of that, and Shapiro's point that it's not evil, and we're going to be about to get to that from some conservative thinkers, and also that it's exclusively a left-wing thing to oppose or be critical of what the United States did with the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, that it's purely left-wing, is simply false. Now, I don't expect and don't even blame somebody like Ben Shapiro to know the history of the American conservative movement to make such an ignorant statement like that. And we've all heard, Dwight Eisenhower, many quotes, one of the biggest ones, this was his view on the bombing of using the atomic bomb on Japan. Dwight Eisenhower, quote, "First, the Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing." That's one quote. Candace Owens has shared some of these quotes, many others. My friend Spike Cohen, Dave Smith, some libertarians have shared many quotes from Dwight Eisenhower, other generals who were with the Allied forces who all, except for one or two maybe, thought that it was a bad idea, a bad thing that we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. But I want to stick to the conservative movement right now. A lot of people don't understand that the early modern American conservative movement was in large part a reaction to the horrors of World War II, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki being central to that. Let's start with this. This is National Review in 1959, so this is 14 years after the atomic bomb dropped. This is what National Review published, the premier conservative magazine at the time and long after. This is what National Review had to say in 1959, quote, "The indefensibility of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima is becoming a part of the national conservative creed." Get it? To be a conservative in 1959 was to be a critic of the atomic bombing. Now, one of the founders of the original conservative movement, one of the founders of National Review, who was integral to it being started, was a man named Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk wrote the book The Conservative Mind in 1953. That book is what took American right-wingers to begin calling themselves conservatives. They used other terms before that. William F. Buckley, before Russell Kirk's book in 1953, The Conservative Mind, William F. Buckley referred to himself as an individualist. Kirk's book came out. It was a big hit with the right, the American right, and people started calling themselves conservatives. This is what Russell Kirk had to say about the atomic bombing, and there's a couple quotes here, but he was dead set against it, thought it was evil, as Tucker Carlson might say. Russell Kirk, quote, "Thus far, apparently, it has been progress," and he's criticizing progress here because he's a conservative, "it has been progress toward annihilation, an end to be, accomplished perhaps by the improved atomic bomb. We have dealt more death and destruction in the space of 10 years than the men of the Middle Ages with their devil were able to accomplish in 1,000. Kirk was obviously a Christian as well. More from Russell Kirk on the atomic bombing. This is the godfather of American conservatism speaking. Quote, "A handful of individuals, some of them quite unused to moral responsibilities on such a scale, made it their business to extirpate the populations of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We must make it our business to curtail the possibility of such snap decisions taken simply on the assumptions of worldly wisdom." This was a man who, with many other conservatives, thought that it was a rush to judgment to use the bomb. One more quote from Russell Kirk, the godfather of American conservatism, and I can debate that with anybody who'd like to. "The real conservative can urge upon his nation a policy of patience and prudence, a preventative war," and we modern Americans know something about that, "whether or not it might be successful in the field, and that is a question much in doubt, would be morally ruinous to us." Now, a peer of Russell Kirk's in his generation in the late 40s, the 1950s, the 1960s, in the American conservative movement was Richard Weaver. Richard Weaver's most famous book was called Ideas Have Consequences. Ronald Reagan, when he spoke before the Heritage Foundation, quoted from Ideas Have Consequences and was a big fan of Richard Weaver's work. This is what Richard Weaver had to say about the dropping of the atomic bomb. Quote, "The atomic bomb was a final blow to the code of humanity. I cannot help thinking that we will suffer retribution for this, that God might punish us for this." That might be close to evil in what Tucker Carlson was talking about. National Review in 1958, this was a year before what I just read about opposing the bombing being a national conservative creed. National Review in 1958 had to say, quote, "The bombing ought to haunt Harry Truman. Was it really necessary? Could a demonstration of the bomb and an ultimatum have ended the war?" Good question. Let's go to some more popular figures that were on the right during this era, in the years after the war, and what they had to say. Former Republican President Herbert Hoover, this is just 2 days after the bombing, had this to say in a letter to a friend, quote, "The use of the atomic bomb with its indiscriminate killing of women and children revolts my soul." Sounds pretty evil to me. This was a man of the right during his time, a Republican. Let's go to another figure who might not be known to modern audiences, and I don't expect Ben Shapiro, anybody like that, to know. But his name was David Lawrence. He is a founder of what today we would call the U.S. News and World Report, a major legacy media institution. He was a conservative. People knew he was a conservative. He was known as such. He said that the justifications of military necessity, when we drop the atomic bomb, or our government dropped the atomic bomb, the people and the government are separate, and governments can be evil, if you didn't know. David Lawrence said that the military necessity will never erase from our minds the simple truth that we, of all civilized nations, did not hesitate to employ the most destructive weapon of all times indiscriminately against men, women, and children. I'll leave you with one more quote. Henry Luce was the founder of Time magazine and was known as a right-wing conservative in his time. That's how he was known. He was a famous guy in media. In 1948, just less than 3 years after the bombing, this is what Henry Luce had to say about the United States government dropping the atomic bomb in Japan. From Luce, quote, "If instead of our doctrine of unconditional surrender, we had all along made our conditions clear, I have little doubt that the war with Japan would have ended soon without the bomb explosion which jarred the Christian conscience." Obviously, another Christian there. So if it's National Review in 1959, and they're telling you, once again, quote, "The indefensibility of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima is becoming part of the national conservative creed." And Ben Shapiro in 2024 saying, Tucker Carlson's he's a left-winger because he would even say this. There's a long history of conservatives at the beginning of the modern conservative movement, the modern American conservative movement, who a major part of their conservatism was denouncing and calling evil the atomic bombing by the United States government of Japan. So, if you want to call that left-wing, you can, but you're either lying or you're ignorant.